Some choices in this world are not made for the harvest, nor for the brief warmth of a neighbor's approval, but for a promise that was buried beneath the winter drifts. Long before the road was paved, a 60-year-old veteran with a heavy limp and an empty bank account spent his small pension on 400 gallons of white latex paint, applying it directly to the trunks of 12 acres of dying apple trees during a record-breaking freeze. The farmers at the H&H diner laughed into their coffee mugs, calling him a lunatic who was trying to paint his way out of a grief he couldn't outrun. What those men did not know was that a single blue cloth-bound ledger contained a handwritten calculation that proved the paint would either save the orchard or break his heart for the last time. Welcome to a quiet space where the truth is found in the soil. And before we begin this journey into Timber Ridge Road, if stories of quiet resilience and unyielding faith mean something to your evening, please take a brief moment to subscribe to our channel and let these words carry you toward a restful sleep. The chill that rolled off the Raccoon River in the early spring of 1962 carried the smell of wet limestone and rotting willow leaves, a heavy damp cold that settled into the floorboards of the old Greer house. Walter Greer sat at the pine table, his woolen coat still buttoned to his chin, his large calloused thumbs tracing the edge of a yellowed envelope from the county assessor's office. The tax notice was short, 3 lines of elite type, demanding $412 by the end of the month, a sum that might as well have been $10,000 to a man whose entire cash reserve rested inside an old iron tea-tin behind the flour bin. The 300 winesap and golden delicious trees that his father had set into the ridge in 1934 were gray, their bark split by consecutive seasons of early thaws and sudden brutal frosts that left the wood looking like charred bone. His wife Margaret had been gone 3 years, her absence a physical weight in the kitchen marked by the blue ceramic coffee cup that remained on the high shelf, its rim pristine and untouched by dust. The town of Harlan had moved on from the old orchard, the commercial packers in Omaha preferring the uniform, chemical-sprayed fruit from the massive orchards in Michigan and Washington. Walter was a relic of a different discipline, his body broken by 3 years in the infantry around the frozen perimeter of Incheon, his left knee a mass of stiff cartilage that clicked with every step he took across the uneven grass. He had nothing left but the 12 acres of timber ridge and the memory of a woman who used to stand by the kitchen sink looking out at the white blossoms until the dusk turned the trees into a low, pale cloud. The catalyst arrived on a Tuesday morning wrapped in a brown paper parcel that had been left on the wooden seat of his old Ford tractor by the mail carrier. Inside the paper was a thick blue cloth-bound ledger and a letter written on the heavy stationery of the Iowa State Horticultural Extension Office. The handwriting was sharp, precise, the ink a dark violet that had not faded during its transit from Ames. Dr. Edgar Holman, a retired research professor whose bulletins on cambium preservation had been standard reading before the war, had kept a record of Walter's father's orchard from the years before the Depression. The letter didn't contain sympathy. It contained a specific mathematical warning about the phenomenon known as Southwest injury, the silent killer of old orchards where the winter sun warms the dark bark during the afternoon only for the sudden dusk to freeze the active sap rupturing the cell walls and leaving the tree to starve from the inside out. The first twist lay hidden between the pages of the ledger written in his father's own loose slanting hand from the winter of 1948, a year when Walter was still wearing an army uniform in the mud of Chaussin. His father had not lost the orchard to mismanagement or the lack of rain. He had sacrificed the crop to pay the medical bills for Thomas Briggs, the neighbor's boy, who had shared a trench with Walter during the winter retreat. The elder Greer had sold the commercial spray equipment and the heavy tractor to ensure that the Briggs family didn't lose their farm while their son was in a military hospital in Tokyo. Walter held the blue ledger against his thigh, the rough cloth catching on his flannel shirt, realizing that the gray dying trees before him were the physical price of his own survival. His clumsy attempts to begin the work were a source of quiet entertainment for the drivers who hauled the grain to the cooperative elevator along Timber Ridge Road. Walter bought 80 cans of discontinued interior latex paint from a salvage warehouse in Council Bluffs, mixing the thick white liquid with river water in an old cedar barrel behind the barn. His first efforts were agonizingly slow, his stiff knee forcing him to drop to his good side in the damp clover, his large brush making a sibilant soush soush sound against the rough bark of the wine saps. He was awkward, his hands shaking with the early onset of a winter tremor, the white paint splattering his denim trousers and his old army boots, until he looked like a ghost working in the shadows of the rows. The second twist manifested when Harold Dietz, the county's largest corn producer, stopped his air-conditioned John Deere tractor at the fence line, the massive machine idling with a deep, rhythmic throb that shook the wild mustard plants in the ditch. Dietz didn't look at Walter. He looked at the white-painted trunk of tree 14, his thick neck red above his khaki collar. He called out over the rattle of the diesel engine, telling Walter that the university had abandoned the latex method 10 years ago because it trapped the fungus beneath the skin, ensuring the roots would rot before the first blossom could open. The town wasn't just laughing at an old man's grief, they were watching him commit what they believed was a deliberate, expensive suicide on a piece of land that Dietz had been trying to buy for $70 an acre since Margaret's funeral. The mini-climax of that first chang came on the third Saturday of April, a evening when the thermometer on the back porch dropped 17 degrees in 40 minutes as a northern front cleared the timberline. Walter stayed in the orchard until midnight, his flashlight beam yellow against the driving sleet, his brush moving with a desperate, frantic energy as he tried to finish the first 5 rows before the wood locked up. His knee failed him on the last tree of row 4, a loose root catching his heel and sending him hard into the frozen mud, the gallon can of paint tipping over to spill its white heart into the gray dirt. He lay there for a long time, the cold water soaking through his jacket, his fingers gray with the latex, looking up at the dark, unyielding branches that seemed to mock the tiny circle of his flashlight. The transition from the cool, defensive stillness of April to the humid density of an Iowa June brought a change in the sensory landscape of Timber Ridge Road. The white latex on the 231 trunks did not fade. It dried into a chalky, permanent skin that caught the morning light long before the sun cleared the eastern tree line. Walter Greer worked 60 hours a week now, his daily rhythm dictated not by the hands of a clock, but by the shifting angle of the shadows between the rows. His knees, stiffened by the lingering memory of Korean frostbite, creaked each time he dropped to the earth to inspect the lower graft unions. The town's laughter had settled into a low, predictable drone, a background noise that accompanied his weekly trips to the cooperative for fuel. It was a static friction he had learned to ignore, a tax he paid for doing something that couldn't be weighed in a grain elevator. The first small failure of the season came in the middle of May, during a 3-day period when the wind died completely and the air turned thick as wool. Walter had noticed a subtle change in the leaves of the young Macintosh seedlings in row 6, the ones he had painted with the lighter 1:1 dilution. The tender green tips were curling inward, turning a dark water-soaked brown at the margins. It wasn't the feared southwest injury, nor was it the sun scald he had spent 3 years calculating. It was fire blight, a swift bacterial infection that could sweep through a young orchard in 48 hours if the humidity remained high. He stood in the row, his blue ledger open against his hip, his fingers tracing the sticky amber fluid that was beginning to ooze from the infected twigs. His movements were clumsy with haste as he brought out the pruning shears and a bucket of denatured alcohol to sterilize the blades between every cut. He knew the rule: cut 1/8 inches below the visible wood damage dip. The tool wipe the blade cut again. But his hands, thick-knuckled and heavy, lacked the surgical precision required for the delicate seedlings. On the 5th tree, his shears slipped, tearing a wide vertical strip of skin down to the bare white heartwood, ruining the very cambium he had spent the winter protecting. He stopped the shears, dangling from his thumb, his breath coming short in the hot, stagnant air. The blue cloth-bound ledger lay in the grass, its pages fluttering in the slight draught from his own movement. He had cut too deep, too fast, his anxiety overriding his discipline. A shadow fell across the damaged branch, long and narrow in the late afternoon sun. Dr. Edgar Holman did not look like a man who spent his life in laboratories. He wore an old sweat-stained fedora and a pair of faded denim trousers that had been mended at the cuffs with green fish line. He had driven his mud-splattered station wagon down the lane without Walter hearing the engine, his trunk filled with wooden crates of soil sample jars and a long brass-handled magnifying glass. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply reached out. A long, thin hand took the pruning shears from Walter's fingers and examined the torn wood with a slow, squinting deliberation. The university branch needs to be taken off entirely now, not just notched. Holman's voice was dry, like old parchment shifting in a drawer. You're fighting the weather with a tool meant for firewood, Walter. Precision isn't about strength. It's about knowing when the metal is sharper than your intention. He didn't take over the work. He stepped back 3 feet, his arms crossed over his high chest, watching as Walter took the shears back, adjusted the angle of his wrists, and made the next cut with a slow, deliberate squeeze that left the wood clean and flat as a tabletop. Holman spent 40 minutes in the row, his magnifying glass held 2 inches from the painted bark of the mature winesaps, checking the coverage around the lower scaffold crotches. He didn't offer praise. He merely pointed his brass tool toward a small shadow gap on the northeast side of tree 42 where the brush had dripped thin. The light of the snow doesn't care about your labels, Walter. It reflects from every direction when the drifts are high enough. If you leave a square inch of dark bark exposed to the winter dawn, the sun will find it. You've built a good wall, but a wall with a loose brick is just a pile of stones waiting to fall. He left before the sun touched the horizon, his station wagon leaving a pair of thin parallel tracks in the tall orchard grass. He had brought no magic formulas or expensive chemical sprays. He had simply brought the validation of an eye that had seen 10,000 trees live and die in the gray dirt of the Midwest. Walter went back to the kitchen table that night, the single bulb casting its long yellow shadow over the blue ledger. He didn't write about the fire blight or the ruined seedling. He wrote 4 words under the entry for May 17th, metal sharper than intention. The third twist, the truth about the town's shifting perception, began to manifest in the 4th week of June, not through spoken words or public apologies, but through the silent currency of the rural landscape. Walter went out to the mailbox at the end of the lane one Tuesday morning to find a heavy grease-stained burlap sack sitting on the wooden platform behind the metal box. There was no note, no name written on the rough fibers. Inside were 42 hand-forged iron tree guards, the heavy curved mesh screens used to protect young trunks from the sharp teeth of meadow mice and cottontails during the winter snows. The iron was old but clean-coated in a fresh layer of black linseed oil to keep the rust back. Walter carried the sack to the equipment shed, setting it on the workbench next to his collection of white paint cans. He examined the weld marks on the iron mesh. They were unique, made with a heavy double-bead technique that belonged to only one man in Shelby County, old Thomas Deeds, Harold Deeds' uncle, who had run the blacksmith shop behind the grain elevator since the Depression. The town was still laughing at the diner, still clipping the jokes from the community notes column, but someone in the Deeds family was quietly ensuring that the painted trees survived the winter pests. The community was not a single solid wall of disbelief. It was a complex lattice of individuals, some of whom were watching the Timber Ridge orchard with a different quality of attention than they admitted over their morning coffee. Tommy Briggs spent his afternoons with the grease gun, his fingers black with the heavy lubricant he forced into the bearings of the old cultivator. He had grown taller over the summer, his shoulders broadening into the shape of his father's, his face losing the soft lines of his school days. He had taken to keeping his own small notebook in the pocket of his denim shirt, a cheap paper-covered pad where he copied the tree numbers and the weekly moisture readings Walter recorded in the blue ledger. He didn't talk about his future, nor did he mention the factory jobs in Waterloo that the other boys from Harlan were seeking as soon as they turned 18. He simply stayed in the rows, his brush making that steady sibilant soush-soush sound whenever a patch of paint needed a touch-up. The first small success came on the second Saturday of July, a day when the thermometer on the north side of the barn reached 94 degrees by noon. The regional packer from Omaha, a man named Joseph Vance, who wore a gray linen suit that smelled of sweet tobacco and cold storage, drove his clean Buick down the lane. He didn't get out of the car immediately. He sat with the engine idling, his eyes moving over the white-shrouded rows with a sharp, calculating assessment. When he finally stepped into the grass, his leather shoes shining like wet coal, he walked straight to the mature golden delicious, in row 3, the ones that had been painted full strength in March. The fruit was there, dense and green, hanging from the lower scaffolds in tight uniform clusters. Vance reached up his manicured fingers, twisting a single apple from the wood, holding it up to the harsh midday sun. The skin was flawless, a pale, translucent green without a single blemish, without the rough brown russeting that usually indicated a tree that had struggled through a late spring freeze or a fungal infestation. He took a small brass gauge from his vest pocket, slipped it over the fruit, and nodded as the metal ring clicked clean over the equator of the apple. "They're consistent, Walter." Vance's voice was smooth, trained by 40 years of buying fruit from 5 different states. Most of the orchards along the river are showing skin splits from the February thaw. The packers are discounting 20% for the cosmetic damage. Yours look like they were grown under glass. I'll take the whole block at $2.40, a bushel clear on the tree if the skin stays this clean until October. The contract he pulled from his leather portfolio wasn't a promise of wealth. It was an acknowledgement of precision. Walter signed his name on the bottom line using his blue fountain pen, his hand steady, his script small and controlled. He didn't look toward the road where Harold Deet's tractor was rumbling past the fence line. He looked at the paper, then at the green fruit above his head. The white paint wasn't an eccentric's whim anymore. It was a line item on a ledger sheet in an office in Omaha, a measurable barrier between a clean crop and a discount box. The first major climax of the summer occurred during the annual Shelby County Fair in August, an event that usually brought every farmer within 40 miles into the big wooden pavilion on the south side of town. Walter had not intended to go, but Tommy had spent 3 evenings cleaning 24 of the golden delicious apples with a piece of damp flannel, placing them in a cardboard crate lined with clean straw. The boy wanted them on the exhibition table, his young pride demanding a public reckoning with the men who had spent the spring laughing at the Timber Ridge orchard. The pavilion smelled of shaved pine boards, sweet clover hay, and the heavy drench of vinegar from the popcorn stands. The fruit judge's 3 elderly men from the state extension service, who wore white lab coats over their overalls, moved down the long tables with their scales and magnifying glasses, their faces expressionless as they weighed, measured, and sliced the entries. Harold Dietz stood by the railing, a large cigar unlit between his teeth, surrounded by a group of grain growers who were watching the beef judging in the next ring. When the blue ribbon was pinned to the front of the straw-lined crate from Timber Ridge Road, the crowd around the table went quiet. It wasn't just a first prize ribbon, it was the sweepstakes medal for the cleanest pomological entry in the Western District. The judge's notes were attached to the wood by a brass staple, perfect skin consistency. No evidence of winter cambium stress or secondary fungal lesion, superior cell development. Dietz walked over his heavy boots clattering on the sawdust floor, his eyes fixed on the blue ribbon. He looked at the apples, then at Walter, who was standing 3 feet back from the table, his old cap held in both hands against his thighs. The unlit cigar shifted from one corner of Dietz's mouth to the other, his face turning a dark, congested red under his straw hat. "A blue ribbon don't pay for 40 gallons of latex, Walter. You can't paint your way out of a dry August. The corn is curling on the ridge, and your trees are going to drop that fruit before the frost if you don't get some rain. A pretty apple on a dead tree don't make a living." Walter didn't answer. He didn't need to. Tommy Briggs stepped forward, his young face tight with an emotion that had nothing to do with the prize. He reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out his small paper notebook, and laid it open on the table, right next to the ribbon, his thumb pointing to the weekly circumference measurements he had recorded since May. The numbers showed a steady, uninterrupted growth curve, a straight, diagonal line that didn't dip even during the 3 weeks when the creeks went dry. The white trunks had kept the tree's internal temperature 6 degrees cooler during the afternoon heat spikes, preserving the moisture that other orchards were losing through their bark. The fourth twist, the hidden development that would reshape the coming winter, manifested during the long ride back to the farm that evening. Tommy sat in the passenger seat of the Ford, the blue ribbon draped over his knee, his eyes fixed on the dark fields sliding past the window. He didn't look like a boy who had just won a county championship. His jaw was set, his fingers locking and unlocking around the cardboard crate in his lap. "I'm leaving after the harvest, Walter." Tommy's voice was small, nearly lost beneath the rattle of the truck's manifold. The John Deere factory in Waterloo called the high school office yesterday. They've got an apprentice slot open in the tool and die shop. Starts at $2 an hour, clear money, 40 hours a week. My mother needs the roof mended before the snow comes, and the orchard is a long way from a weekly check. The word struck the cab like a dry, cold front. Walter didn't turn his head. His eyes remained locked on the yellow beams of the headlights cutting through the August dust. The iron tea tin in the pantry contained enough money to pay the boys' wages through November, but it didn't contain enough to match the steady mechanical certainty of a factory paycheck from a corporation with 10,000 employees. The promise he had made to Thomas Briggs Sr. in the mud of Korea wasn't about holding the boy back from a secure life. It was about ensuring he had a choice. If the tool and die shop was what the boy needed to fix his mother's roof, the orchard would have to wait. "I'll have your wages ready by the last day of October, Tommy." Walter's voice was even, his fingers not tightening on the wheel. "You've learned how to keep a tool sharp. That's more than most boys take to Waterloo. You use that grease gun well, and the factory won't break your back." They drove the rest of the way in silence, the sibilant soush-soush of the wind against the truck's side mirrors, replacing the sound of the paintbrushes. The harvest came in October, a 6-day stretch of 16-hour days, where every apple was lifted from the wood by hand and placed into the slatted wooden crates Vance had sent from Omaha. 460 bushels, clean and heavy, were loaded into the commercial trucks at the gate. The check Walter received was exactly what he had calculated, $1,104, the largest gross revenue the Timber Ridge farm had seen since his father's death. He paid Tommy his final wages on a Friday night, the bills crisp and green on the kitchen table. The boy took the money, looked at the blue cloth-bound ledger sitting by the stove, and walked out the door without looking back. His old Ford coupe roared as he started it in the lane, the sound dying away toward the highway until there was nothing left but the ticking of the kitchen clock and the low northern wind gathering in the empty rows. The second major climax, the beginning of the Great Crisis, arrived on the night of December 24th, 1968, 6 years after the first white coat had been applied to the orchard. The intervening seasons had been kind to Timber Ridge. The trees had grown thick and strong, their trunks carrying successive layers of white skin that gave them the appearance of an ancient sacred grove. But the winter of 1968 was a structural anomaly, a biological trap that no pomological bulletin had predicted. The month of December had been warm, unnaturally so, with temperatures hovering in the high 40s for 2 weeks straight. On Christmas Eve, the air felt like April soft wet and smelling of damp earth. Walter walked the rows of his young Macintosh trees at dusk, his heart pounding against his ribs with a low, rhythmic dread. He reached out his thumb, pressing it against the terminal buds of a 3-year-old whip. The scales were soft, turning a faint, dangerous pink at the margins. The tree was waking up. The prolonged warmth had broken the internal chemical dormancy of the wood, drawing the sap up from the rootstocks into the fragile cambium layer. The white paint on the trunks was working. It reflected the direct solar rays during the afternoon, keeping the wood from warming above the ambient air temperature. But the paint could not change the temperature of the air itself. If the air remained at 48 degrees for 14 days, the cambium would activate regardless of the color of the bark. The entire orchard was now biologically awake, its cells full of water, its defenses dropped completely vulnerable to any sudden shift in the polar jet stream. The shift arrived at 3 o'clock on the morning of January 7th, 1969. Walter was awakened by a sound that felt like a mortar shell detonating against the north side of the house, a sharp splintering crack as the northern wind tore a loose shutter from the window casing. The thermometer on the porch didn't drop. It collapsed. In less than 18 hours, the temperature in Shelby County fell from 38 degrees Fahrenheit to -23. It was an Arctic front of unprecedented velocity, a massive wedge of Canadian air that locked the entire state of Iowa in a gray, sunless vise. By the morning of January 11th, the wind had died, leaving the air perfectly still and deathly cold. The thermometer by the barn read -27. Walter stood on his porch, his breath forming a dense white cloud that froze instantly into ice crystals on his woolen collar. He looked out at his 12 acres in the pale twilight light of the dawn. The orchard looked like a collection of iron sculptures, the branches stiff and fragile as glass, the white-painted trunks standing out against the snow like teeth. He walked to row 3, his boots sinking 2 feet into the dry, powdery drifts. He reached out his gloved hand, his thumb pressing against the southwest face of tree 47, the finest winesap in his block, the tree he had planted within 20 yards of the kitchen window so Margaret could see the blossoms from her sink. The bark didn't feel solid. It gave way under his thumb with a small papery crinkle, a hollow throb that indicated a pocket of dead air beneath the surface. He took his pocket knife from his trousers, his fingers so cold he could barely wedge the blade from the brass scales. He made a small 2-inch vertical slit through the white paint into the cambium. The tissue was black. It wasn't the rusty brown of a typical sun scald. It was a deep charcoal, black, dry, and charred by the intensity of the sudden freeze. The water inside the cells had turned to ice crystals, instantly expanding with enough force to rupture the cell walls across the entire circumference of the trunk. The white paint had failed. It had done exactly what Dr. Holman had designed it to do. It had prevented solar radiation from warming the wood during the February afternoons. But it had no defense against an ambient event where the air itself dropped 50 degrees in a single day, catching the awakened tissue like a soldier without a coat in a sudden blizzard. The crisis was systemic. It wasn't a matter of losing a few branches or 7 old trees past their prime. If the cold remained below zero for another 5 days, the ice crystals would reach the heartwood of every one of the 239 trees, killing the entire orchard down to the rootstocks before the spring could even find them. Walter stood by tree 47, his pocket knife still embedded in the ruined bark, the wind beginning to rise from the north again, carrying a fine, sharp grain of ice that stung his eyes. He was 60 years old now, his hands stiff with the early winter of his own body, standing alone in a frozen field, with 40 years of labor turning to charcoal wood beneath his fingers. He had no hired hand, no wife waiting in the house with a hot kettle, and no technical bulletins from Ames that could stop a thermometer from reading -27 degrees. The town's old judgment seemed to hang over the timber ridge like the gray sky itself, the silent, unyielding certainty that he had spent his life chasing a shadow, building a wall out of latex and paint, while the real cold was waiting for him from the air. The cold did not break on the 10th morning, but the wind did, leaving a silence over Timber Ridge Road, so absolute that the snapping of a small twig under the weight of the frost sounded like a rifle shot in the grey woods. Walter Greer did not go back inside the house to warm his boots. He remained standing in the 3rd row, his gloved hand still resting on the ruined bark of tree 47, his eyes tracking the grey, low-hanging clouds that blocked the Iowa sun. The dark charcoal wood beneath the white paint was a calculation that had run out of numbers. He knew that if he stayed on his porch, waiting for the Weather Bureau in Des Moines to offer a change in the jet stream, the remaining 238 trees would become nothing more than cold timber by the first thaw of March. His knees ached with a deep, dull throbbing as he walked back toward the tool shed, his boots crunching through the crust of old snow. He did not have the strength of his 30-year-old self, nor did he have a crew of young men with shovels to clear the drifts. But he had the blue cloth-bound ledger on his kitchen table, and beneath its blue spine lay 19 years of recorded failures, every late frost, every chemical burn, every mistake that had ever cost him a crop. He sat down at the table without removing his coat, his stiff fingers turning the white pages past the typed letters of Dr. Holman until he reached a small, handwritten note from the winter of 1955, an entry he had made when his father's old hog barn had frozen during a January blizzard. The air is the blade, but the earth is the stove. If you cannot stop the wind from biting the skin, you must bring the warmth of the deep dirt up to meet the wood. The realization didn't arrive with a sudden flash of light. It came with the slow mechanical logic of a man who understood that every problem in the soil had a material weight. The paint was a shield against radiation, an architectural barrier built to reflect the glare of the winter afternoon. But a shield was useless when the enemy was the very atmosphere surrounding the shield. To save the cambium from the ambient freeze following the premature dormancy break, he needed an insulator, a secondary skin that could trap the latent heat rising from the deep unfrozen earth beneath the snow line. He stood up his chair, scraping loud against the clean linoleum, his mind already checking the inventory in the back of his truck. The old Ford pickup rumbled to life on the third turn of the key, its exhaust a thick blue plume that hung motionless in the 0-degree air as Walter turned toward the county highway. He drove 35 miles south to a commercial nursery supplier on the outskirts of Des Moines, his knuckles white against the plastic steering wheel, his mind calculating the remaining balance in his iron tea tin. He bought 12 bales of heavy burlap wrap, 3 rolls of 2-inch agricultural foam tape, and a case of dark tree wound sealant, a thick brown paste that smelled of boiled linseed oil and old pine tar. The total came to $161, more than twice his annual investment in latex paint, spent in a single desperate response to an emergency that no one else on Timber Ridge Road believed he could survive. The work began at dawn on the 12th of January, with the thermometer still locked at -15. Walter worked alone in the rows, his fingers stripped of the heavy rubber gloves because the thick foam tape required a precision that his covered knuckles couldn't manage. He applied the tree wound sealant to the split face of tree 47, first working the dark paste deep into the carbonized wood with a small wooden spatula, sealing the moisture in before the air could dry the exposed heartwood completely. Then he wound the 2-inch foam tape around the trunk, starting 2 inches below the snow line, where he had used his bare fingers to claw back the frozen crust, going up 36 inches to the first scaffold crotch. The burlap wrap went on over the foam, a double layer of the rough brown fabric that he pulled tight until the fibers groaned, securing it at the top and bottom with short lengths of tarred baling twine that he knotted with his teeth when his fingers refused to bend. The bristle brush was gone now. The sibilant soush-soush of the spring painting was replaced by the dry, rasping friction of the rough burlap against his wool trousers, a heavy, rhythmic scratch that filled the empty rows like the breath of an old animal. He worked from first light until the sky turned the color of cold slate. At 4 o'clock, his body moving with a stiff, repetitive discipline that left his lips cracked and bleeding from the frost. The fifth twist, the true nature of the community's silent transformation, revealed itself on the third night of the rap program, just as the moon was rising over the eastern ridge, cold and sharp as a broken piece of china. Walter was working on row 5, his hands so numb he could no longer feel the twine between his fingers, when the twin beams of an old pair of headlights illuminated the snow behind him. An ancient Ford coupe stopped at the gate, its engine idling with a loose, familiar clatter that Walter would have recognized in a thunderstorm. Tommy Briggs didn't get out of the car with a greeting, nor did he mention the tool and die shop in Waterloo, where his mother's roof money was being earned. He simply walked through the gate, carrying his own pocket knife and a pair of heavy leather mittens, his face dark beneath a thick wool cap that was crusted with gray frost. He walked straight to the next tree in the row, took a length of baling twine from the bundle slung over Walter's shoulder, and knelt down in the drift without saying a single word. His young hands, trained by 4 years of sharpening axes and clearing wiregrass, took the rough burlap and pulled it tight over the foam tape with a single practiced jerk that left the knot clean and solid as a fence post. They worked together for 5 hours under the blue light of the winter moon, their breaths mingling into a single white cloud that trailed behind them through the orchard. There was no dialogue between them, no explanation offered for why a factory worker making $2 an hour had driven 80 miles through a blizzard just to wrap pieces of brown sack around a collection of frozen wood. The connection between them wasn't something that needed a name over coffee at the diner. It was a structural weight, a promise kept to a private named Thomas Briggs Sr., who had died in the freezing mud of a country that Harlan had forgotten. By midnight, all 239 trees were wrapped from the dirt to their first branches, their trunks looking like rows of bandaged soldiers standing at attention in the snow, protected by a double barrier of white latex and brown cloth. The winter gave way to March, not with a sudden burst of warmth, but with a slow, muddy softening of the ruts along Timber Ridge Road. Walter walked the orchard with his clipboard in the third week of April, his heart steady as he began the tedious process of untying the baling twine and removing the burlap from the mature golden delicious block. The results were recorded in the blue cloth-bound ledger with the small fountain pen tree 1 through 46, cambium wet green resilient. No secondary split. Dormancy preserved. The orchard had survived. The loss was limited to tree 47, which leafed out weakly in the first week of May, its few green leaves turning pale and brittle before the blossoms could even form. Walter took it down to the stump in August, standing with the idling chainsaw in his hand for a long time, looking at the rings of dark wood that marked the year of the Great Freeze. But the remaining 238 trees put out a growth of tight green extension that was thicker than any season since his return from the war. The dual strategy, the paint for the radiation, the wrap for the ambient chill, had worked. The harvest of 1972 was the one that the regional packers would talk about for 20 years, a autumn where the weather stayed clear and the temperature dropped just enough at night to turn the skins of the wine saps the color of a polished mahogany desk. Walter's gross revenue reached $1,893, with a net margin of $681 after the cost of the burlap and the latex had been cleared from the iron tea tin. It was a small sum to the grain operators who handled thousands of bushels of corn, but it was a durable margin built on precision rather than acreage, on knowledge rather than luck. The sixth and final twist, the ultimate resolution of the conflict between Walter and the town, occurred on a Thursday afternoon in October, just as the last crates of Golden Delicious were being loaded onto the Omaha trucks. The green John Deere tractor that had spent 10 years throwing mud against Walter's fence posts stopped at the gate. Harold Dietz didn't lean over the steering wheel to shout an insult. He climbed down from the high cab, his boots stepping carefully into the grass, his hand holding a small black vinyl pocket notebook that he had carried in his shirt for 5 seasons. He stood at the edge of row 3, watching as Walter wiped the dust from the scales of his old iron picking ladder. The unlit cigar was missing from Dietz's mouth, his face showing the pale-lined exhaustion of a man who had spent the autumn fighting the fluctuating prices of the Chicago grain market. He looked at the white-painted trunks, then at the clean golden fruit that remained in the upper branches of the last row. His voice came out small, stripped of the gravelly loudness that had dominated the diner on Main Street for 2 decades. I've been watching the bark on my North 40 timber, Walter. The maples are splitting along the ditch line from that 69 freeze. Lost 12 of the old shade trees behind the house this spring. The extension agent says it's the sun's cold. He stopped his fingers, locking around the plastic binding of his small black notebook, his eyes fixed on the white bark of the nearest tree. He didn't look at Walter's face. His pride was still the local currency, but it was a currency that could no longer buy a solution to the dead wood on his own land. The paint you used back in '62. Is it a specific agricultural brand from the university, or does any store latex hold the reflection when the drifts are high? Walter came down from the 3rd rung of the ladder, his hand coming to rest on the blue cloth-bound ledger that sat on the wooden platform of the frame. He looked at the man who had laughed at his loneliness, the man who had told the town that his brain had been cooked by the timber ridge. There was no triumph in Walter's eyes, no desire for an apology or a public reckoning on Main Street. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his small fountain pen, and tore a clean white leaf from the back of his ledger, writing 3 lines of technical specifications with his small, disciplined script. Any white interior latex will bounce the radiation herald. You want to dilute it 1:1 with creek water for the young wood so the skin can stretch during the June rise. Keep it full strength on the old timber and don't stop until you're 2 inches below the dirt line. The sun doesn't care about the name on the can, it only cares about the color of the wall. Dietz took the paper, his rough hand brushing against Walter's fingers for a brief second. He looked at the specifications, nodded once without looking up, and walked back to his green tractor. He didn't slam the glass door this time. He drove away down Timber Ridge Road with a slow, quiet cadence that matched the rhythm of the orchard itself, the sound of his diesel engine dying away until there was nothing left but the wind in the empty branches. The final climax of the Greer place came in November of 1981, 27 years after the first seedlings had been set in the ground. Walter's knees were no longer a matter of morning stiffness. The cartilage had gone completely, making the climbing of the picking ladders an impossibility, and the heavy lifting of the 40-gallon spray drums too painful to sustain without assistance. He sold the 12 acres to a young couple from Ames named Dale and Patricia Voss, who had seen the Iowa State Extension Bulletin where Dr. Holman had recorded the Timber Ridge Orchard as Case Study 3. Walter spent 3 days walking the rows with them, his old Ford pickup moving at a crawl between the white trunks while he pointed out the graft unions and explained the thickness of the winter wrapping twine. On the final afternoon before he moved his single iron bed and his collection of wool shirts into the small retirement home near the church in town, he walked to the equipment shed and brought out a heavy wooden crate tied with 2 lengths of baling twine. Inside were the 7 blue cloth-bound ledgers, their spines frayed by 30 years of grease and thumbprints, their pages containing every line of data, every letter from Dr. Holman, and every entry about the death of Margaret's trees. Patricia Voss took the crate from his hand, her fingers tracing the old blue cloth of the first volume. She didn't look at the land deed or the property lines. She looked at the tight, disciplined script that filled the open page where a description of a fungal spray was followed by a brief note about the height of the snow on a February morning. These aren't just farm records, Mr. Greer. This is a map of how to stay alive on the ridge. It's the only thing that tells us what to do when the numbers don't work anymore. Walter pushed his old cap low against the late autumn sun, his eyes moving over the 238 white columns that stretched out in perfect squares toward the timber line. The orchard didn't look ridiculous anymore. It looked complete, a permanent architectural installation built from latex burlap and 30 years of silent discipline. You keep the paint clean in March, Patricia. The wood will do the rest of the work if you give it a wall to hide behind. The final image of the Timber Ridge orchard belongs to a clear afternoon in January of the year 2013, years after Walter Greer had been laid to rest in the military cemetery behind the church on Main Street. Patricia Voss stood at the kitchen window, her hands drying a ceramic coffee cup with a piece of linen, looking out at the 12 acres through the frosted glass. The world had changed. The old green tractors had been replaced by massive computerized machines that could plant 100 acres a day, and the old diner on Main Street had been turned into a convenience store that sold gasoline to the trucks on Route 44. But the orchard remained. 238 mature apple trees stood in straight, white-shrouded rows against the blue drifts of the Iowa snow, their trunks glowing like candles in the pale winter light. The white latex was fresh applied the previous March by a new generation of hands that had never seen the cold hills of Korea or the mortar ditches of Incheon. The burlap wrap was tied tight around the base of every trunk, the brown cloth holding the latent heat of the deep earth against the bark, preserving the dormancy of the wood until the proper time for the blossoms to wake. The white trunks were not a decoration, nor were they a monument to a man who had lost his reason to the loneliness of the fields. They were a physical vocabulary, a silent language written upon the bark to explain that the things which protect us from the cold are never the things that make the most noise on the road. The true value of a life's labor is not measured by the loudness of the cheering when the crop is brought to the fair, but by the quietness of the walls we build to keep the living tissue safe when the world is frozen and everyone else has gone inside. The best decisions usually look ridiculous from the highway because the highway is always moving while the trees are built to stay. Now that the rows are wrapped and the white trunks are steady in the snow, the work on Timber Ridge Road is finished for the season. The long shadows have crossed the fence line, and the cold wind from the north has settled into a low, quiet hum that lives only in the upper branches. If you have found a sense of peace in these fields tonight, if the story of Walter's Wall has brought a quiet comfort to your evening, we invite you to leave a comment below to share what a silent heritage means in your own life. The stove is cooling down, the ink in the ledger is dry, and the orchard is sleeping safely under the winter moon. Deep under the white paint, the cambium is cold and still waiting for the spring. Close your eyes now. Let the sibilant whisper of the old brushes fade into the quiet of the room, and let yourself drift into an analytical, restful sleep. Good night.